Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's part of the beginning of a series, I think. Which of Contradiction 1? Subtitle as well. It's Bodies, Bonus Feats, and Burden of Knowledge, a prelude. EyePatchNotes says, we're going to begin peeling back layers of white lies and withheld information in these Pathfinder Parley. Pathfinder 1st Edition has two asterisk schools of player-owned animals, familiars and animal companions. Putting aside the needlessly broad term companion, animal companions are typically associated with cavaliers, a main class in Pathfinder, druids, rangers, and paladins. Other main classes exist, but we can stick to those D&D friendly specimens first. It should be said at the beginning that each animal companion and familiar here has their own bestiary entry / starting stats. So the first hurdle is selecting which body most suits the player's needs. Yeah, you want a raven or a monkey or an octopus with different abilities and stats and such. Animal companions are notable for their standalone scaling. They have ability scores, feats, and combat mechanics independent of the player. Druids can thus be considered a high ceiling class, themselves full-speed spellcasters with a second martial character sheet. Regardless of the druid's build choices, the animal companion is always at full power. This comes with the responsibility of filling said second character sheet and the druid's spell list, so a player could understandably seek simpler pastures. It's a lot of decision points. Now, familiars are simpler, as they largely cannot be customized. They have a base stat line and then borrow their master's bonuses, like stat bonuses when they're better, I guess. Where animal companions include lions and gorillas, for example, int 2 with strength 30, familiars have the power of house cats and monkeys. The local wizard's pet raven has the intelligence of a small child and likely the strength of one. However, this is an acceptable trade-off, since familiars make excellent independent scouts with full language capabilities. You can see on the chart here at a side a comparison of the abilities of the familiars. You can see that while the familiar side is much less significant in terms of its statistical powers, there are inherent advantages to having a companion that is small. Like a raven can more easily scout things than a gorilla, for example. That's just useful for some things that a lion isn't. And of course, it sounds like there's the idea here that they can magically speak completely as well. Certainly, I remember my own experiences with warlocks in Dungeons and Dragons. You can pick a Pact of the Chain warlock, which lets you get some familiars that have pretty sophisticated utility abilities, but still aren't particularly significant statistically. So, for example, they can hold things in their hands. You said monkey, so we have that option here. And they can talk. They can potentially speak multiple languages. They might be able to turn invisible, for example. These are things that are useful in a way that being strong isn't. So it's interesting. The druid has or that example anyway, animal companions can have a very, very high power ceiling, but only of a certain kind of power, possibly. That's an interesting one. I'd have to know more about Pathfinder. But we're going to come back to this more. The thing to take away for now is that there's a complexity buildup. You're playing a wizard. It maybe isn't an uncomplex class, but you're thinking a druid. You have to pick all your spells for a druid. You're playing a spellcaster. That can be a little more involved in these types of games. You've got to pick your spells or whatever. But then you also need to make an entire other character, which is, like a fighter equivalent. That is your, lion or whatever. So, complexity management thing that we're going to come back to. EyePatchNotes continues, some classes like Wizard and Witch, think Pact of the Chain Warlock with like a pet demon familiar, are defined by their first level familiars. Where the divide between combat companion and helpful familiar gets blurry, though, is the Eldritch Guardian Fighter subclass that also gets a first level familiar. Fighters normally have no business with a second non-combat body, except Eldritch Guardian has a clause to allow their fighter feats to be used by familiars. Now the non-combat body can brawl with the rest of them. Okay, hold on. So, so if the fighter has a shield bash, a trait where they can do a shield bash for big damage, an effective shield attack, this means the the companion can do that too. The fighter gets a tavern brawler feat that makes them good with improvised weapons. They can pick up a bottle and get a good attack bonus to using something that like wasn't exactly designed to be a weapon. The familiar can also get that bonus. Is that what's going on here? Interesting. That sounds bad, sort of, but I'm sure there's a way to make it good. Right, because a lot of, oh, that's the next part, or that would be the case, they can brawl with the best of them, if not for two asterisk issues. The fighter and familiar will share their feats, but a pet pig cannot physically handle a spiked chain whip. Right. The familiar may not be able to physically use many of the things required for the type of thing you'd think a fighter would have as a feat a lot of the time. And so the trick seems like it would be to find fighter feats that are usable by something that isn't humanoid, possibly, let alone, can hold something with a strength of 8, I'm thinking many of these familiars can't hold almost all weapons, for example. They're just too heavy, basically, to be swung with any meaningful amount of force. Anyway, familiars also have a physically anemic stat spread, yes. A player who opts into the Eldritch Guardian subclass is now responsible for picking feats that can be used by both bodies, or accepting that only one body will benefit. Said responsibility also includes reading about feats a fighter would not ordinarily have taken. Players who want a second combat body would do well to pick up an animal companion rather than a familiar. However, familiars are less of a knowledge burden while having more out-of-the-box utility. The system will support a player who wants the best of both worlds, but only as far as showing them the door. Everything beyond must come from the player's willingness to just read. And then we have some follow-up questions, which I'm going to read before I get into discussing them. How similar can different playstyles be? Is the player able to adapt their preferred playstyle to resemble another? The echoes of an offering. We'll see if we have time to get to it. What knowledge is being asked of the player? And can the player opt out of a system's excess questions? For example, understanding the system and still running less than a, quote, full loadout? Right, I'm going to start with that first one. So the interesting topic of this parlay, and as far as I can tell, is this idea that games have a tension between letting the player put in more or less cognitive effort and the way in which that does or doesn't provide the player equivalent power, or the way in which opening up options for the player also kind of puts the burden of working through those options onto the player. So when you allow your Eldritch Guardian fighter with its first level familiar to use the feater can use the fighter feats, you're kind of also opening up that the player now has to think about whether the feats would be used by the companion. They don't have to think about that, but that is something you're kind of inviting in. Cool. I'm going to start with talking about the opting out of a system's excess questions. This is something we've brought up in Parley before from EyePatchNotes. This idea that if there are different levels of complexity in a game, does the game, or how does the game, make those things of relatively equal power so that the player actually can choose what level of complexity they want without not having the intended experience. So for example, if a fighter is easier to set up, there are less decision points, and they might also matter a little bit less in the sense that they don't completely determine your capabilities as a fighter. If a fighter is easier to set up like that, are they of an equivalent power level to a druid who has to build an entire fighter and also makes an entire spellcaster? They don't do anything unless they pick spells that allow them to do those things. I'm sure they do some things, but they shapeshift or whatever, you'd imagine. But most of their features are, they can cast a spell that does this, but you have to specifically seek that out. You don't need to make up the spells in a lot of games. Certainly not in Pathfinder. But you do need to go find spells that do things that would be, for example, powerful. Not that that's the only thing that would matter. Turn it around and talk about things being fun. Well, the fighter has few enough decision points that you'll have the fun that's there in all likelihood, if it's something you'd find fun. You don't have to set up the potential fun or find the potential fun. You can pick fighter and you will much more easily have the fun that is there if that is a thing you're going to enjoy. Whereas a druid, you could likely play and miss over things that you would enjoy because you need to go find them yourself to some extent. Or hopefully your game master will help you with that, of course. But I think you get the point. There's a lot more decision points. The burden is on the player, both in terms of finding an experience they would like a little bit more, and also in terms of making the thing powerful to some extent. But overall, certainly in Dungeons and Dragons, there's an experience that I've had, kind of a problem, I think, with Dungeons and Dragons, that spellcasters are just straight up better at essentially everything than people who don't have spellcasting. They have to make more choices, but I would argue that many times, even if they make less choices, they are stronger in essentially every way than martial characters. You could design a campaign in a way where that wasn't the case, but the decision points do give you more power. And you might think, well, why wouldn't they? Because it takes more effort. So if it takes more effort and it doesn't make you more powerful, well, why would you do that then? But either way, there's kind of a problem. If you make it so more decision points makes you the same level of power, then some players won't see it as worth taking those decision points. But if you make decision points make the player more powerful, it might feel like you're not supposed to play the game in a way where you don't make those decision points. You might be thinking, well, but what if the group just doesn't care about that much? It's no big deal, right? Well, it might very well not be. I think that these open-ended role-playing games are theoretically a good place for this, where being more powerful, for example, just doesn't necessarily matter that much. But something to consider is that the player that's a druid with a combat body gorilla, well, they might just take more actions in combat than the other players. A lot more of the game is objectively them at the center of the playing, so it does make it a little more difficult to evenly divvy up time. Now, a way to solve that would be to make it so the more involved classes get less involved companions, and, the other way around. But it seems like the opposite is the case here, first of all. And you'll also note that to some extent that kind of breaks your ability to opt into complexity. So there's some tension here. Does that make sense? There's a question about how you manage the player being able to choose how complex things are. How do you manage that and allow the player that choice, if you want to allow them that choice, while also balancing the gameplay experience, not necessarily just in terms of power, in terms of fun, in terms of socially including everybody a reasonably equal amount at the gameplay table, and also how you manage the raw power level of each decision point. How do you make it feel worth putting effort into this new thing? Personally, my solution to the final thing, how do you make it so, investing your efforts into making decisions is rewarded? I think the easiest solution is that you get a new, not otherwise possible option, but it is of relatively equal power level. So you get what you might call horizontal progression, not vertical progression. You get stronger because you get an option that didn't exist previously, not because you get a more powerful option, and a more powerful version of something you could have done before. You don't make your fireball do more damage by multiclassing into another spellcasting class. You make it so you can make your fireball be a different element by multiclassing into another spellcasting class. The fireball can do something it couldn't before, but it isn't any better at the thing it could do before. You could think of it that way. Or you get a electricity fireball. There's a spell in D&D that's like, yeah, anyway, I could do a whole parlay on that. Really a topic for another time. You get the point. There's this interesting tension, and I think, so far, the best solution I've heard to this tension is to make it so you can kind of invent new options. I really like the wording EyePatchNotes used, where the system supports a player who wants the best of both worlds, or new options, and how it does that is that it shows them the door to those options. It shows them, like, okay, here's where you could build on this and make something of your own. But we're not going to hand you more power necessarily. A thing I've often brought up about Dungeons & Dragons multiclassing in 5th edition is that of all the possible multiclassing combinations, many of them are, at least with mathematical analysis, weaker than a single class character. So if you don't have something specifically in mind and you multiclass, more decisions makes you weaker rather than stronger, which I think is okay. First of all, a player more involved in making decisions is likely a stronger player. They'll get the most out of the mechanics they have. So from a balancing perspective, not the only thing that matters, but it's relevant to this discussion, that player doesn't need as much help. It's okay for them to have a somewhat weaker experience. And many people are willing to drop some amount of power for something they like. Everyone has their own threshold at which this isn't better or different enough from another option, so I'm just going to pick the one I like. For some people, that amount is very small. It has to be essentially perceived as identical to the other option to them before they'll pick what they like. But a lot of people, especially people who play these games more often and are properly reassured that they don't have to worry about every scrap of damage they can get, will eventually loosen that a little bit and will be willing to accept something they just prefer at a modest loss to their character's power. They can complete the challenges, they have faith in that, or they understand what the threshold for that is, and then playing with the net up, and they know where that net is, they can calmly choose to enjoy what they enjoy within a certain threshold and be assured that that's not going to make it so they can't have fun, or they're not going to be punished for doing that. At least I think that's good when that is the case. So I would say to some extent that answers this question. I think the idea that there are options, the very idea that there are options for familiars and animal companions, which are of different levels of complexity. One doesn't really have any of its own progression or feats or whatever. The animal companion kind of has its own thing going on. And it's not that one is better than the other, but they have completely different utility. Like, the familiar is good in ways the animal companion isn't, but isn't at a raw power level higher than the animal companion. In theory, that seems good. It seems cool that you can pick, for example, spellcasters that have a familiar or possibly also an animal companion, and also spellcasters that don't have either or one or the other of those things. Martial classes that do have a familiar or animal companion, and martial classes that don't have either of those things. So you can kind of customize the amount of complexity that you want, assuming all those things are relatively equal. Now, I do want to add a little note here, since I don't play Pathfinder. It doesn't seem to me like that actually would be that balance, though. Like, while these two things have different strengths, I feel like the overall combat potential of the druid, in your example, seems preposterously high, like ridiculously high. The way you framed it, there isn't really a reason the druid doesn't play multiple characters at the same time, like full characters of a full power level. They're building their own fighter. Maybe that, it's not an Eldritch Guardian fighter that gets its own familiar, companions on companions, but still pretty close. And I do also want to say that being able to completely control the animal companion would often yield power, positioning, or being able to use a buff on the companion in some way to get some benefit, but you reliably have a body to get damage out of that buff or something. I don't know. I think there is an issue here where, while the utility in a role-playing game overall might be similar, it kind of feels like the utility for the activity that if you fail, you die, which is combat, the animal companion literally is just better. It is just not as good at some other things, but those things are arguably not as important. Again, that's fairly subjective to the type of game you play at your role-playing game table. And it's also fairly subjective to how the game's rules work. Like, I feel like in Dungeons and Dragons, I would say, yeah, they have different strengths, but it's easy to replicate the strengths of the familiar, but hard to replicate the strengths of the animal companion. Therefore, not only are the different strengths of different contextual values, it's also just, again, like the activity that the animal companion is good at is an activity where if you fail at that activity, you die. Whereas if the familiar fails at scouting, you might be in an encounter where you would die, but if it was an animal companion, you would survive that encounter. This might be getting a little bit too much into balance for some people's taste. I just think it's interesting to note the way in which, for a lot of players, they would feel like, well, but I'm concerned about things being good on my character, so I don't really feel like I can not choose that option. An interesting solution that I've seen in Dungeons and Dragons is that a lot of summoning spells have different amounts of complexity that they include. So some of them you pick from one of 3 stat blocks, and that's what you get. That's it. You summon a demon, but they have 3 stat blocks, kind of generic cookie cutter stat blocks, that you could then flavor however you wanted. A flying demon, a charging demon, a humanoid demon. or so, I don't remember exactly, but something like that. Whereas there's another spell that's just summon any, challenge rating 2 or below beast. Just go read all of them, and then find one that's good, maybe, and summon that. Which, those are pretty different amounts of knowledge requirements, but I don't think those abilities are of very different overall utility, is the point. You can do different things with the beast summoning spell. You could argue it has more utility. If you want like a combat pet out of it, though, it produces about the same overall combat value as the demon cookie cutter block summoning spell. I hope I'm remembering these correctly. Don't focus too much on this. If you play D&D and you're trying to think of what spells these are, I don't know. But it's just an example. So I'm not sure. I like the idea of the fighter feat thing, but we also added complexity there. To summarize this point, I think that my ideal experience would be that the player can choose any matrix of effort and type of benefit, and it doesn't really confer the player with any direct power if they put more effort into managing things. It just gives them the potential to make something strong in a new way, or a remix of things that wasn't possible previously. And it's on the player to make that be a thing that is actually a net positive. Basically, it's trying to balance to be a net neutral. It'll be weaker if the player doesn't have a great idea, but they'll probably use it to good effect. And the idea is that the player gains a new technique rather than a stronger technique, a new capability rather than a stronger capability. And that can be in and of itself stronger, but it means that the amount of effort the player puts in isn't correlated with the player having, more power or more stuff to do. Again, another thing I want to note just as a social thing at role-playing tables, a player more involved in making their build may already be the kind of person who would kind of overpower the other player's experiences at a role-playing table. So giving that player even more times when they're meant to interject doesn't really sound like a good idea in my humble experience. I feel like that's something to balance, and I don't like the idea that a player that wants to take over the table is given a class that literally tells them to take over combat by playing 2 characters at once. That seems not good for a lot of social environments. Personally, as I've mentioned in previous role-playing game discussion Parley, I don't play role-playing games with anybody other than people I've known for like years. So this isn't a problem at all for me, but I've known many people with whom it would be, and I chose not to play with those people. But it's not the end of the world. I'm just being antisocial. I'm just pointing out that that would be an issue you'd want to overcome or keep in mind were you playing at such a table. Anyway, okay, so having answered that, or talked a little bit about that I guess seems like the ideal to me. And it seems like Pathfinder, the way you've presented it, has quite a matrix of, you pick a spellcaster, which is maybe more complex, or a martial character, which is maybe less complex on average. And among spellcasters and martials, it sounds like, there are options for spellcaster that has no companion, spellcaster that has a familiar, and spellcaster that has an animal companion, and martial that has no companion, martial that has a familiar, and martial that has an animal companion. Which seems good. Having that matrix of picking the amount of effort you want seems cool. I really like the idea that the player can kind of unlock an advanced version of the game that doesn't explicitly benefit them too much, but in theory could result in new powerful things, and definitely gives them new options if they want them. Again, for me, Dungeons & Dragons multiclassing has a really good opportunity cost for that. Because you level only one class at a time, you can very quickly get 2 really weak classes, which are way less strong than one fully leveled class. So you really need to blend them quite carefully. It needs to be something the character really benefits from or needs or will use, rather than just getting a whole bunch of stuff. That doesn't tend to be that helpful. You could design a game differently where it had a different opportunity cost. Like, for example, you could make getting a whole bunch of utility stronger by making it so classes in D&D got less spells. They get a lot of utility, so usually having one spellcasting class means it doesn't gain you much by getting a whole bunch of other spells, because you can get most of what's there a lot of the time. But you could change that, for example. You may be multiclassing a few classes that don't get that many spells. Sorcerer in D&D, for example, And in that case, perhaps that would change. But they get a lot of cantrips. Anyway, let's get back to how similar can different playstyles be? Is the player able to adapt their preferred playstyle to resemble another? Well, we just got into that whole thing about how it seems like Pathfinder has a matrix of different classes that have, they're martial but no companion, familiar, or companion, etc. And so the answer is vary, I guess. You can probably pick the martial no companion class that is closest to the Eldritch Guardian fighter's benefits, but without a companion, if you want to, sort of. That sounds incredibly modular. You had said in a previous EyePatchNotes parlay that you felt like one of the things you liked about Pathfinder was how it has this sort of universal currency nature to it, where you can mix and match things to a really extensive extent. Derp. And I think that sounds really cool too. I said that was a type of game design I really admire, the idea that things are very, very modular like that, though it increases the player's power a lot to put them in that situation. In particular, I don't really understand multiclassing in Pathfinder yet, and so it seems to me like there isn't really a good reason not to multiclass in a game like Pathfinder. If you can level both of them at once, or they have more independent progression just for having them, it doesn't seem like that would be much of an opportunity cost, but maybe that just means that the baseline number of classes is 2, and then there's a lot of opportunity cost for which one you go for. The point stands that it sounds to me like the idea that you don't want to get into it very much comes at a very large cost to the power of your character, whereas in my experience in D&D, it doesn't. It does come at some cost because spellcasters are unbalanced and overpowered, but you can still play like a barbarian or a fighter, and they are very simple to play at the simplest, but they're quite powerful. You get to do some very strong things. There's really no need to make more than a handful of very simple decision points. A lot of these would be things like pick your fighter fighting style, and in D&D that might be like, well, I'm using a bow, and there's one called archery, and the other ones don't affect me using a bow, so I do need to choose one of them, but you see what I mean. It's not exactly rocket science if you are having trouble choosing between them. By contrast, you can absolutely make a fighter with a lot of decision points in D&D. Anyway, to some extent, I think it's important to remember that the game, Pathfinder or whatever game, may have some intention for what type of experience of choice the player wants. So Pathfinder, for example, this might be a bias of mine, but I associate as being a game that is kind of about you wanting a little more choice. So it's not fully necessary. That's another question. It's not fully necessary, I don't think, or is it, for a game to allow you to fiddle around with how much choice you're making that much. I have thought a lot about different role-playing systems that prevent the player from needing to make a character at the beginning of play. They have to put in the most effort into making a build when they have the least perceived reward for putting that effort in. They haven't played the role-playing game before. For new players, it seems like kind of a lose. That being said, I don't think it's unreasonable for a game to say, look, this is a type of experience where you're meant to bring a desire to do that kind of thing a little bit. We're not going to make it so anyone with an infinitely low interest in this activity is perfectly handheld through being interested in it. You have to bring some amount of interest. That's fair. To some extent, I would argue it's not necessary. Like, there is a way to kind of guide players through these things in most cases, but I do think that's worth bringing up in this discussion. Do we really need to be so harsh on a game that is just saying, we expect you to want to put in a minimum floor of effort, basically? No, but I do think it's worth asking as a game designer, does your game need to not cater to that, basically? If players don't yet want to do that, but you want to welcome them in, does your game need to not do something to welcome them in? An example of what you can do in Dungeons & Dragons or similar games, for example, there are some games that use this tactic where you start as a level 0 character, and initial sessions consist of becoming your level 1 character sheet, which I have done once to great effect. I think it's really fun. I think it's just fun, and it also turns that period of not even knowing what you want into practicality. you're literally dying right now, you can take a feat to summon up your experience as a level 1 peasant and find out that you know how to do a shield bash. Do you want to do that? This is the utility it would give you right here. You're not speculating about whether you would use it. This is the situation where you would use it. Do you want to pick that thing? In some ways, I think that is kind of just better. And then if your group doesn't want that, then you can just not do it in subsequent campaigns. But as a way to introduce players to the game, I don't know. I think it's really cool. A game that has written in it ways to do this if you want a little hand-holding, rather than some game masters listening will think, oh, I'm just going to do that, and they're already writing notes for how they're going to do it. But if you want a little more guidance, but what I just said sounded cool, you can look at, I think it's called Dungeon Crawl Classics, was where I first read about this idea, but I didn't actually use much of that version of the idea. I just read it and thought, oh, I would do my own version of that, and then I was off to the races. But if you want more guidance, Dungeon Crawl Classics is a game that I think has that design. I hope I'm not saying the wrong game. Anyway, obviously not sponsored. I don't really know if I like that version of it, but I think the idea is cool and has a lot of merit. Anyway, especially if the player is meant to manage a lot of stuff. Just a little side note, if Pathfinder is a game where it feels like the kind of base number of classes is 2, there's another thing I like about the idea of starting with, a character is being made during gameplay. You can pick a class, but then if you pick a class that feels kind of like a short-term thing, or it fit the storytelling really well, you still get to pick another class without really losing that much. That's kind of interesting. You sort of get to make a character sheet right at the beginning of the campaign before you start playing, and make a character during gameplay, because there's a part of your character you maybe wouldn't have made yet once you finish that like level 0 gameplay and you make your character. You're not making that character before gameplay. You're just adding a character sheet's worth of stuff, a multi-class, after you've made your character during play. That could potentially be kind of cool. I suspect EyePatchNotes from previous Parley you've done, you don't want that as much. You don't want to have to make your character on the fly. You want to path it all out, Pathfinder boo, before you start playing the game. But I think it's an interesting note. It's something that design could enable. There's a little bit of an extra thing that I wanted to chime in about, which will hopefully help me wrap up. This is a side note from EyePatchNotes about animal companions. So I wanted to go on it on my own for a little bit to tell you what I thought before including this part. But here's a little summary. EyePatchNotes says, animal companions in Pathfinder 1st Edition are buildable martial characters all on their own. Familiars are straightforward and less combat focused. Despite this, the player can force their familiar to learn combat feats if they accept the burden of doing so. Why might a player jump through hoops to make familiars resemble animal companions when they could just run an animal companion? Less stuffy EyePatchNotes here. I've tried to simplify the original narrative for the main Parley, but I did want to include some of the mechanical bits here. This Parley marks the first chapter of the Witch of Contradiction, which will take a while to break down into manageable chunks, starting with the mentioned burden of knowledge. Pathfinder 1st Edition has 2 commonly accepted resources, D20 PFSRD, Pathfinder Source Reference Document, and Archives of Nethys. PFSRD is natively powered by Google, but mixes in third-party unofficial content into first-party content. Also, for legal reasons, content is renamed or absent, still favored by some players. Nethys has the official stamp of approval from Paizo, Pathfinder's parent company, but has hyperlink inconsistencies and a notably weak search engine. I vastly prefer Nethys for not bombarding me with third-party junk, thanks. Both animal companions and familiars have a dedicated list of options to choose from, and base stats can vary wildly. Nethys' link for familiars is here, though mostly as a formality. It's attached in the Parley document. Here's an example of a wizard familiar. I'll just click it and see if there's anything I want to go off of in this short time. But to continue, EyePatchNotes says, after selecting a familiar, it has simplified stat calculation compared to an animal companion built from the ground up. The familiar has a maximum of half the master's hit points, then uses its master's proficiencies and saving throws when superior. Combat capable in theory, but think of all the skill checks. Points if the familiar can fly and fit into small spaces. This does result in an overall lower ceiling, though, as I had been hinting at earlier, as the familiar is tricky to customize outside of tech like the Eldritch Guardian. It has not quite come up quite yet, but the Witch of Contradiction has the similar beast-bonded subclass that grants the familiar 1 feat. However, unlike the fighter's feat sharing, the Witch must lose a feat for the familiar to gain one. Some familiars, notable monkeys, can have opposable thumbs, like hands, with which to wield typical player weapons. I'll leave that to the rules lawyers. Right, so I was saying before, there's some question about whether the idea that the familiars have different utility is kind of pedantic because they don't have the more meaningful utility, basically. Or there are a lot of things that let you, well, I mean, in D&D, maybe there aren't in Pathfinder, a lot of ways to scout at a distance. You know, it's good to have a raven that can do it, but it's not as powerful as having a gorilla that helps you fight. That's all I'm trying to say. And so that just that option might be less interesting because of it. It's okay for things to be less powerful. I hate that I'm focusing on that so much in this, but I think you get the point. Now, I wanted to note this bit that you mentioned about how the sort of takeaway question here is why you might jump through hoops to make a familiar like an animal companion when you could just run an animal companion. In other words, looking at that matrix of options and everything that I said about, well, you get to kind of pick and mix and match the amount of complexity you want. Okay, yeah, but like, why is there an option to make familiars more complex when they are the less complex option? Right? And I think one answer is that it allows you to kind of remix familiars to be a companion that has the level of raw power or utility of the animal companions, the combat companions, but not necessarily only combat utility. Like I would imagine some of the fighter feats that are better with animal companions are going to be stuff like flanking or disarming enemies or something like that, not so much like you suplex the enemy. Do you see what I mean? So they might not be good at the same type of fighting, but they could still be good in combat, possibly in a way that is tactically relatively equivalent to the benefit of a gorilla, if you want that. So that's one answer, would be that it allows you to address the idea that your familiar is of this a similar value. You want to invest in your familiar and amount like a combat companion, an animal companion, but you don't want it to be through raw strength, or you want the path that familiars take. It sounds less complex, maybe. You have to figure out what feats would work, but there's not as much stat block choosing. I'm just briefly looking at, I'm scanning the familiar document, just to give you a few examples of things that familiars can be that like might not have come up as part of this parlay, and you can imagine how these could be useful in ways that could be somewhat martial. A king crab came to mind, like foxes, like a flying fox. Okay, that feels like something that could have some utility. Hawk could be combat worthy, sure. Isopods, sure, why not? Something like a mongoose or a mole, sure. We mentioned monkeys already. For real, a monkey seems quite feasible as a combatant. Daggers, a slingshot. Anyway, there's a pretty interesting strategy you can do with warlocks, with imps as a familiar, in Dungeons & Dragons as a Pact of the Chain warlock, where you give your imp a sling and you use magic stone to enchant rocks to be rather damaging. You can do a lot of damage at very low levels by having you and your imp both, open fire on an enemy, your imp with the slingshot. That is quite powerful. Imps have this interesting thing as well where they have, it's called Devil's Sight in D&D. You can create magical darkness that only Devil's Sight can see through, or, well, very few things can see through. And then you can get Devil's Sight, and your imp has Devil's Sight, and you could both shoot with advantage, and the enemy has disadvantage hitting back at you. With advantage? Anyway, but they're not going to be able to hit you very easily while you fire away at them. Pretty nice. Not too many of the other companions are sticking out, but like an owl is another example. Another thing I wanted to mention here is that these say that they give the master of the familiar gets a bonus. So for example, if you pick a moth, the master gets a +3 to survival checks for having the moth as a companion. Interesting. Quite a few of them seem pretty unique. Like there's not a huge amount of overlap. There's a lot of stealth options. Maybe there is a lot of overlap. Let's not. That's a strong claim for knowing this system not that well. But the point is that it does let you get different options and then include up the utility of a companion. You want to make something that has a similar power level to the animal companions that the other classes get, but you want the power in a different form, and the game allows you to kind of write that yourself if you want to. I think that seems like a totally reasonable reason to want to reason through making a companion combat viable. What do you think about that as a response? It sounds like this is going to be a sort of a prelude to more discussion about specifically the witch as a class option in Pathfinder, so I'm looking forward to it. Thanks very much for the parlay. I hope people enjoyed it. If you want to get your own parlay like this, you can read about how to do that in the description.